Right. Thank you very much, Anil. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed the lunch, and I hope it was not too soporific, because if it was, we've certainly got a panel that will keep you awake. The talent on this panel will, I'm sure, give you many thoughts this afternoon, and we hope to get some questions later as well. So I want to begin with some initial thoughts from each of the panel members, including myself, about delivering value, because one of the things that strikes me about the word value is that we haven't necessarily defined what we mean by that in terms of either design, construction, or building value for that matter. So this session on delivering value is going to examine the wider context of value within mega projects particularly, but also generally within the market, and also bring in some perhaps international learning to that debate as well. So I think on the panel today, the bios are in your pack, and we've got the names up on the slides. I'm going to actually use a construction team approach and just stick to first names. So in fact, we've got Tim, we've got Debra, we've got Jim, and we've got Ali on the panel today. And we're going to discuss delivering value. So I want to talk about delivering value in a wider context, because I think, to quote Oscar Wilde, a cynic knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. But clients and construction professionals are not cynics, since the commitment to build requires an opportunity-driven, value-creating approach. But the term value can mean many things to us in construction, I think, depending on your own stakeholder interest. And as well as value of the built asset, in other words, the outcome that was discussed in the earlier session, it can encompass wider societal benefits and whole life performance. And that's the area that I want to spend a little time discussing more about in this session. So how would we define value in this latter context? Well, to capture the maximum benefit that projects or programs can achieve, or even portfolios of programs can achieve, the definition of value, I feel, and we feel at the RICS, should be expanded to include areas such as whole life value, capital and operations carbon emissions, digital effectiveness, BIM and data capture, the use of industrialization, standard components and pre-manufactured value, design quality, even collaborative behavior and supply chain integration, the apportionment of risk and reward and aligning those incentives for risk and reward, the social value of the construction process, and of course, last but certainly not least, the health, safety and well-being during the construction process. Or put another way, enable the triple bottom line of environmental, social and cost to be properly measured and managed. Why should we do this? Because this is a bit of a culture change for the industry, moving away from lowest price wins and that kind of decision making that quite often accompanies procurement decisions. Because, as McKinsey's already been quoted today, significant productivity gains can be made across the whole construction sector, from infrastructure to house building, from design right through to construction and maintenance, repair and occupation, with a relatively small change in approach and behaviour. And let's face it, the current business model is highly transactional, with little motivation for the hundreds of designers, contractors and suppliers to properly engage with each other at the early stages of a project and stay attached to and learn from the asset once it's in use. So we're going to begin to get a lot of data from these assets in use, and perhaps that's going to drive the BIM model design process more so than ever as that data becomes available. And the current business model leads to a repetition of mistakes, failures to adopt best practice, and often the delivery of a suboptimal end product, low margins, and ultimately a lack of industry investment. And a recent study in Europe actually showed that good design, for example, could improve learning in schools by 10%, increase productivity in the workplace by 20%, speed up recovery in hospitals by 27%, and help to reduce crime rates by 67%. So these are the outcomes that construction can add the value to. And this becomes even more significant in mega projects. Certainly in infrastructure, the total cost of ownership is a key issue. And it's a key issue for governments around the world. in order to attract that private sector investment that they need in order to get the infrastructure built in the first place. And innovation in project deliveries such as P3 and PFI help to focus decisions on these wider issues and certainly have a good track record in delivering the initial capital product, but perhaps need to improve their track record in terms of the management of the operation of the asset. So how do we do this? How do we widen the debate in construction to increase this value offering? Well, put simply, it's bringing people, process, and technology together. Particularly, I feel, in terms of project initiation, where all these trade-off decisions are generally made. The big decisions are made at project initiation. For example, assessing wider metrics for business case across whole life outcomes, design quality, program, capital cost, and social value at briefing will allow a sliding dashboard for decision making. And this is actually being put into effect, by the way, in certain government models. Procure for value. We need standards, process, and technology to do this, and many of the measures already exist in terms of cost-benefit analysis, but we also need more informed clients and robust professional standards through competent talent. This would lead to procurement decisions, both for consultants and contractors, that are taken through the lens of that wider value and therefore are not just about lowest cost. Finally, who needs to advance this agenda? Well, certainly the leaders of industry, governments, clients, and universities. The market, the private sector market, is also advancing this agenda as well through green value, corporate social responsibility, better analysis of private sector investment in infrastructure, capacity and skill issues, and technological innovation, as we've heard much about today. And lastly, professional institutions like my own through standards and competency development. And actually, every construction professional in this room needs to progress that agenda. So, having said what I think value is and what I think the issues and challenges are about value, I'd like also an opening statement from each of the panel members. We'll then have some questions, and then we'll revert back to questions from the audience in the usual format. But going back to questions, going back to the opening statement from the panel, I'd like to start in the way that we're actually sat there. So, Tim, I wondered whether you could, in the way that I have, just provide your opening thoughts on delivering value.
Sure. Thank you, Alan. Alan, I think when you look at the industry as a whole, you need to put it in perspective. This is an industry that reflects 13% of the world's GDP. So it's one of the most significant industries in the world. However, when you look at the performance of the industry and the opportunity to provide value, productivity here in the United States has stayed the same since World War II. Every other industry has advanced significantly. The performance of mega projects, as you mentioned, average cost overrun for mega projects of schedule, 61% overrun of schedule, 71% budget overrun for mega projects. And we see it in New York, we see it in California, we see it in the UK, we see it in the Middle East. When you look at these opportunities, when I was with McKinsey, we developed the publication that I think you referred to, Alan, Reinventing Construction, that talked about how can productivity be improved. We looked at 7 levers of improving productivity that could have had a net gain of up to 60%. The biggest impact in productivity gain advancement came from the advancement of digital and technology solutions. And by doing that, and by just normalizing productivity in the industry to the average of the other industries, not just the best, but the average, could yield a net value gain of $1.6 trillion per year. Now, $1.6 trillion is the GDP of Canada. It's 53% of the GDP of the UK. So we're talking very significant numbers. So the advancement of technology, like the previous panel talked about, is one of the biggest opportunities for the industry to drive value and create value. When you look at the engineering and construction tech industry, the advancements that have been made over the last 5 years, we've seen significant trends to the point that over the last 5 years, we've seen $18 billion invested in tech companies. That's double what it was invested the previous 5 years. We're seeing first movers like Suffolk, where my colleague Jit is leading their digital transformation. We see Bechtel, Skanska, Turner, all of these first movers who are embracing technology are seeing significant gains in an industry that has the lowest level of investment in research and development and technology. So the opportunities and the ability to drive value, Alan, I think is very significant. And I think the ones that embrace a more digital and technology solution are the ones that are going to advance the fastest.
Thank you very much, Tim. Debra, I wondered if we could also hear from you, please, from a technology perspective.
Well, thank you, Tim. You took my whole pitch. But basically, I come from Autodesk, and I've been with the company for over 16 years. So we've been talking about BIM for 16 years. So taking the technology from design, digital data, all the way to the construction site is really what our company provides today around BIM solutions. And we call it connected BIM. So you're taking that information, big data. Now we have a portfolio that construction IQ. So you have project insight, you have dashboards. So you can really look at all your projects. And so when I look at value, I look at, okay, digitally we're providing that, but on the separate end, I'm also looking at education and talent. How are we going to get the next generation embedded in this digital transformation, right? What I'm seeing today globally, because I have a field team out there working with universities, and we're seeing it at the graduate level. I think we've got to think about how do we deliver this value at a lower level and introduce undergrads, look at STEM, look at trying to make construction more appealing. So I think that's another segment as well. But as far as delivering value, you're getting a better product digitally, getting the right information to the right people. You have AR, VR, really visually showing your product. And then we've got robots that are going to be doing these things over and over, these repetitive things. And that's industrialized construction. It's coming. So all of those pieces are really going to deliver value in the near future.
Thank you very much, Debra. I've got to go slightly against the agenda now before Jim starts with his overview and just ask you, as a female in the technology industry, the image of the industry has already been discussed in these sessions, but how can we improve the image of the industry to attract talented females?
I would say, I think that just add technology to it. Don't make it or perceive it as dirty, dumb, and dangerous. We have to start utilizing all the technology out there, have women as mentors, show them, bring it down to the STEM level because we're losing girls at the 7th grade level, and show that we have construction professionals out there doing some fabulous things. So you have to start earlier and then bring it into construction later on. But I would say make it more appealing because I think there's a lot of digital savvy next-gen women that would want to join.
I hope you're right. Jim, could we hear from you, please?
Absolutely. And just to follow on from what Debra was saying, also with women getting them engaged in the industry, I think other agencies like CMAA, ACE Mentor, getting to young women professionals or young women in middle school is key to getting them into the industry, getting them into college, getting them into our industry to help drive innovation. And again, following along all the themes here, I think mega projects are becoming more and more prevalent, I think, more than we may even realize in our built and our planned construction environment. I mean, it harkens back, not since 1930s to the 1960s have we seen this many mega projects going on around the country, right? Harkens back to the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the mega projects that they had for the highway systems, where they had put millions of people to work. Right, the value was, taking the energy out of the Tennessee Valley, River Valley, and creating electrical power, or leveraging that industry for interstate commerce on the interstate highway systems. These were the value that was driven from those projects. Now, we haven't had substantial legislation from the federal government to really drive innovation in our country since the early days of the 1990s through our ICE-T programs, the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Acts. More and more states and cities have to rely on their own devices to fund their capital programs. I think that mega projects linked with social infrastructure and linked with federal and state legislation and their mega projects can really drive value in our industry. And this is why. So if you look at it now, there was a study that was recently done that indicates that the number of mega projects that have gone into into start over the last 10 years has risen from 3% of the total construction market up to 33% of the total construction market. That's an incredible jump for one modality in construction, right? Now also, it anticipates that in the next 10 years, they're going to put $2.5 trillion of work in place through mega projects on in-place construction. That's $300 billion a year being put in place by mega projects, right? That represents 20% of all construction going into place in our market in the next 10 years. That's an incredible amount. Do we even know if we can handle that type of capacity on the planning phase? So this is really, really very critical for us, right? Another key indicator is 3 states, New York, California, and Texas, will represent 40% of all mega projects going into planned construction in the next 10 years. So you can see the problem we're going to have. These mega projects are going to be focused around major metropolitan areas in certain states. So think about the strain that that's going to put on local infrastructure to keep cities running while they're supporting mega projects, right? Think about the labor, trade, and materials strains it's going to put on those cities. Think about the supply chain, about supplying these projects, right? How are we going to combat that? Now, we as an industry must learn to drive innovation into these mega projects. And I think a key part of that is we have to become brave, okay? We can do this, but we have to think outside the box. It's not just robotics. It's not just new technologies and programs. It is the whole compendium of innovation that we need to kickstart a new wave of construction, right? We need to embrace modularization, embrace robotics, embrace AI, embrace machine learning. Think about the type of data that we can, big data that we can mine to do lessons learned from manufacturing processes, right? Another way that we can create value is through maybe combining mega projects. Think about this, cohorts of mega projects. 3, 6, 12 mega projects, combining the resources and being able to truly control the supply chain, being able to drive innovation, lean on machine learning and lean on innovation, lean on lessons learned to drive the processes that really gain value in the industry. You know, in closing, my wife, I had talked to her about this whole process and this whole thing about this, and she said to me, wow, that's amazing. It's amazing that there's such an opportunity for your industry to make a difference, to drive innovation and create value for the stakeholders, for the community. We need to know what value is to each stakeholder. It's not the same for the community, for the contractor, for the owner, or for the financial institution, right? And she said, the biggest hurdle is going to be fear. People are afraid. They're afraid to take that step because you know what? Taking that step is just one step too far. We can play with it. We can do all the R&D and the case studies and all that information you want, but we're not going to take that step. It is this body right here. It is us who will create the energy to overcome the inertia of fear to drive value and innovation in our industry. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Jim. Could I have your thoughts, Ali, please?
Sure, thank you. So as a former procurement lawyer, I can't help but speak in terms of procurement and exactly where we need to see some reform and change and especially innovation. I think of it in terms of what you alluded to already, which is best value, and moving away from an old paradigm of lowest bid or the cheapest bid. Nobody does business like that anymore, right? We want best value, especially when it comes to mega projects. And what does that mean? That doesn't just mean pricing. Unfortunately, that still happens even when I see best value contracts come out and procurements come out, the decision tends to be made on the pricing, which is unfortunate, but it's changing. But what that means is you want partners that have a good successful record of delivery. They have a good track record of delivering on budget and on time. They have a good labor regulation standard. They have a safety standard that you can be proud of. They follow environmental laws and regulations. And they have a proven track record of being a good partner for a lot of times for the mega projects, being the government agency that's the owner, and for the end user that depends on that infrastructure or that construction project. So on one hand, you need best value on these projects, and that's quantifiable along a series of metrics that we can all debate and talk about, but they're proven, and we should be evaluating any potential partner as well as infrastructure delivery entities along those metrics. So one, it's that. The other component I always think about when I think about value is the public purpose that is paramount behind every project that we actually all embrace and we sign up to deliver. So infrastructure is public work. Construction impacts people's lives and communities. In my perspective, that has a global scale as well as a local scale, right? We are living in an interconnected world that's getting smaller and smaller by the day. We do live in a global economy, and our end users routinely travel around the world and want the best value for their community that they can get from a project. It must match, especially, I'm definitely biased, but especially for a place like New York, that needs to be a global city that's a template for the rest of the world, if not just the country, to follow. So one, companies like AECOM with about 90,000 employees in 150 countries are able to bring about that global experience together with lessons learned and best practices that we see play out in other parts of the world, and are able to connect those dots in all of these communities, in all of these local projects to say, what is working where? Aviation is an excellent example of that industry that's going through a transformative change. Probably maybe the biggest book of business in the US in the next 10 years will be transformation of our aviation sector and airports. Why? Because the rest of the world already beat us to it, right? About 10, 20 years ago. We're finally trying to catch up now. It's happening all around the world. We're able to bring some of that experience from even other continents and see what the end user is desiring and is preferring, and how people actually travel rather than the way we want them to travel. How do they actually want to do business, and what sort of infrastructure do they want to see, and bring that back home. And that segues to the local impact. Whatever we do impacts lives, whether it's construction, whether it's staging, it causes some sort of disruption in somebody's life. I think as an industry, we are getting better using technology at learning what people's desires are, what their needs are, how their lives are impacted, how we can mitigate those, and how, more important than anything else, we are getting better at listening and learning. It used to be a very siloed industry where, you know, you put the project out, everybody embraced it, it moved at its own pace, and you really didn't have to worry about what that meant for people in the neighborhood, in the community, at the city level, at the state level. We're all getting better at listening, and we're able to better communicate that in real time to the end user, which eventually makes the project and the construction actually better. It provides a benefit that you want to be proud of. And so at the end of the day, it's really best value that we as contractors, consultants, academics, professionals, government agency owners want to embrace and agree upon with expectations from the very outset as to what that best value must be. And then it absolutely, at the end of the day, inherently has to embrace the public purpose that is paramount behind it. And we must hold ourselves true to it. So sort of the democratization of infrastructure and accountability behind it is key, which is why I think you see a lot of conversations around that very idea now. We, for example, put out a future of infrastructure report every year. It brings about 10,000 residents from 10 global cities, and we see patterns emerge and similarities and commonalities. And how can we embrace the power of that sort of data to better design and then construct projects that can really compete in a global economy? I think that's best value.
Okay, thank you very much, Ali. That's all very interesting. I think in terms of an overview of what we're talking about in this session, that's been excellent. So I want to ask the panel now about the drivers of change in this market that are bringing a more value-based approach to projects into play. And particularly, is the government listening, or is the state listening? Because mega projects are generally concerned with the public sector, not exclusively, but quite often, or at least have some public sector public investment. So can you tell me a little bit about the drivers of change and whether it's beginning to affect practice in terms of public procurement, for example? Because that's very legislatively driven. So I want to see whether these ideas are gaining traction in practice in this market. Tim, do you want to start there?
Alan, when you look, you know, this is a debate I've had for years with people from the UK or the Middle East when they ask about why doesn't the US do this, that, or the other thing? And it's not the US, it's 50 different states. Mm-hmm. We have 50 different sets of regulatory bodies. 34 of the 50 states allow public-private partnerships. We don't get together on all that. They disagree on how that works. When you look at funding, you look at ASCE's report showing the forecasted demand for infrastructure to bring it up to a state of good repair is roughly $4.5 trillion. And the forecasted funding that's available from the states and the federal government is about $2.4 trillion. So we have a significant shortfall there. Yet states like New York and many others don't allow public-private partnerships that will help offset that burden in a very significant way. The states that have done that, like Virginia, like Utah, like California, like Texas, have seen a significant advancement in the number of projects that are being delivered in a most effective way.
And I'll jump in here also. And you know, Tim, it's right. So 34 states actually permit design P3s, but only 7 states use it effectively, right? So now you have the city of New York or the state of New York, when Governor Cuomo has given individual P3 authority for LaGuardia, and they've also done one with the Port Authority, but it is not available to all agencies at all times. So it's not really an arrow in their quiver that they can use to start tackling their capital programs. I mean, just recently in the state of New York, the governor gave limited design build authority to specific agencies. And it's great because they have the opportunity to now implement that delivery method. However, the problem is that they have delivered design, bid, build institutionally for 60 years, for however long they've been around. So how do you take an organization, and the real challenge, I think, is not just around legislation, but also in how do you change the culture of these organizations to be where they've held the power, the control over design and contracts, to have them abdicate that responsibility out in a design, build, delivery, and still be effective and efficient. The culture needs to change inside organizations, for public agencies, and the market itself has to change, because do contractors really know how to deliver design build to New York City and New York State authorities? It's a big challenge.
Thank you, Jim. Do you have any comments on this public sector issue in terms of best value, Ali? I'm sure you do.
I don't know why anybody's laughing. Why are you laughing?
You're the lawyer.
How much time do we have? It's a mixed bag, right? So it's changing. I mean, so just to take a step back, we should definitely be honest and have a real conversation about what's needed. So if you look, and I know a lot of people here have heard me speak about this because I'm sort of a nerd about infrastructure and history, so I can't help myself. But if you think about New York infrastructure, go back, less than 100 years ago, who else was building tunnels under rivers? And who else was building subway lines at the pace and the scale? Who else was building high-rise skyscrapers? Who else was building international airports at the size and scale that New York was? Nobody. Engineering standards and designs, construction practices were engineered and pioneered in this city and this state, right? We have the Thruway Authority that predates the National Highway system. So across the board, whether it's surface transportation, underground, whether it's aviation, whether it's ports, New York pioneered infrastructure, not just for this country, but for the rest of the world. And at some point, we lost the ability to do so. We can obviously debate as to what happened. But the reason why I make that point is when I was working in government and we started talking about design build for the first time and drafting the legislation and changing the regulation, one of the biggest challenges was we couldn't find anybody in state government on the professional or the design side that actually had done design build. Because for 60 years, 50 years, we just stopped pursuing mega projects. We just did not do that sort of work in-house anymore. So what do you do when you say there's a shortage of talent and just a dearth of experience? You obviously go outside and find the talent where you can find it. So therefore, you see a lot of international firms playing in New York because it's a necessity. You need to work with people that have done this before. So it's changing, and I think it's evolving. It's probably not as fast as some of us would want. For example, progressive design build. We're still debating design build. I want to get to a place where we can actually have an honest conversation about progressive design build and its application and benefit. But the point I'll make is this now on the private side, so I can sort of wear multiple hats when it's convenient, is that we're all client-driven at the end of the day, right? Construction infrastructure is primarily designed and constructed and delivered by the private sector. The public sector in New York does not do construction in-house, right? So it's got to go to somebody else. So then who holds the decision-making power? It's the public sector, but somebody else actually has to deliver it. So I think the biggest change that we need to see is the client's culture of cultural change, like Jim was alluding to, which inevitably happens every time where I have these conversations or you get some innovative methodology or some new technology or some new solution that's been tried and tested somewhere or maybe hasn't been. And the first question you get is, have you ever done this before in New York? Well, if you haven't done this before, I don't know how I'm going to pay for it. I don't know how to price for it. I don't know how to evaluate it. I really don't want to talk about it because I don't want to have to go back and sell it to somebody else because they're going to ask me the same question. What are you selling me? Why would we do this? We've never done it before. And that's part of a cultural problem, right? So I think there's a lot of tech companies here, and obviously we hear a lot more, especially on the MTA side, a need for the tech sector to be supportive of transformative change at the MTA. But the other half of that equation is the MTA ready to have a conversation about transformative technological change? And I think that's evolving and it's changing, but it can't just be on one side of the equation, it has to be on both. The client has to be ready to pay for it, to actually be built for it, for example, and also has to embrace the change culturally and bureaucratically that comes with bringing in a new skill set and new solutions that otherwise are not already ingrained into the fabric of that public sector. So I think procurement's a key part of it. One example I'll throw that out there is agencies in New York still to this day, in many cases, are legally barred from entertaining unsolicited proposals. It depends from agency to agency. Some agencies are allowed to do it, some are not. It's standard practice in many states, and especially standard practice in Europe. You have a technology, you have a solution. There's a startup company, for example, that's invested in R&D, and especially in the context of, let's say, transit, developed a solution that could actually move things faster, more efficient, and cost less. You actually are legally barred from going to that agency and saying, let me do a presentation to show you how I can solve your problem. It has to be competitive. So it's just not the world we live in anymore. We want to be able to single source and sole source technologies that can be delivered and implemented faster than what we used to, because that's where the best value will come from.
Okay, thank you. But actually you lead on to something, a specific question that I was going to ask Debra to bring her into this debate, because a lot of these decisions in terms of whole life performance and sustainability and better value are obviously made at business case, project initiation, as I said in my opening statement. And one of the things that's interesting about BIM is it doesn't seem to be used in that area very much. Because I hear architects say that at sketch design stage we don't use BIM, it mitigates the art of the process, and we certainly don't have cost information connected with that initial design information. So is that an area the technologists are looking at, Debra, in terms of, if you like, better decision making at the front end of projects?
Yes, I do think that you need to have that decision making, and you need to have that digital design in the model in the design process at the outset versus doing it at the end. I think it's a better process to have that information. And as I think one of the panelists said, you have to have that organic model and, sketching it first and then developing a model. I think that's more of your norm versus I think BIM has been around for a number of years, and it shows that if you have that model to begin with, it's just cost efficient. And like I was saying earlier, taking that design data all the way to the construction site and being able to reuse that data instead of entering a model over and over again, get the model right the first time, get it detailed out, and then pass it along.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, just moving on to another sort of question, because we've talked about the public sector, and obviously a lot of mega projects and societal benefits originate from those projects, but I don't think it's limited to the public sector, this debate, certainly, is it? It's the private sector is now increasingly looking at concepts like green value and corporate social responsibility, and they are wondering how they can add value to their schemes in terms of the general marketplace by looking at perhaps more value-based approach. So I wondered, in terms of particularly Ali and Jim, I suppose, initially, whether you felt there were any areas where there were good exemplars in the private sector looking at a wider approach to procurement and a value-based approach, and perhaps you could talk about those.
Yeah, I'll throw out an example that comes to mind. So when I was still working in government, we were approached at one point, without naming the company, but approached by a company out of Europe that had developed a particular rubber composite material, got the patent on it. It was very unique. It could be basically shaped into a pipeline sort of shape and extended. It could sort of be compressed and extended for quite a long time, a few miles, for example, and easy to deliver, easy to move, not heavy, very light. And the reason why I mention that is the whole idea, and especially the commercial value of such a product, was the ability to deliver concrete onto job sites. So obviously, Manhattan's an island. We do a lot of projects around it. We move a lot of concrete trucks into Manhattan every single day. You see them all around you every day. And here's a company that said, you know what, I could bring one barge every day that would replace 14 concrete trucks in the city of New York and park it, anchor it somewhere, and basically be able to extend out this pipe and deliver concrete every single day. If you start doing the calculation on the value of construction and pollution and idling of trucks, the noise, the ability of taking these trucks off the roadways that are already congested, it's sort of almost a no-brainer. But then you run into exactly that problem with procurement, right? Can you actually entertain this as a serious proposal? Never done it before. Have you done it anywhere else before? Well, yeah, somewhere in Paris we did it once. Okay, well, is there a way to be able to test this out? Could we do proof of concept testing? For example, a lot of agencies aren't geared up for it. That's happening now more than I've ever seen it before, which is good. But I think, answer to your question is, when I think about those exams, then eventually we got them to a place where they got a smaller contract to be tested out. But I think we didn't maximize the full benefit of what this could have meant for many projects in Manhattan. And hopefully that will change. So I think there's private companies that can make this work, but they run into that wall, especially when they're global companies that have not experienced New York City bureaucracy or New York State bureaucracy, for that matter, and the regulation here. So part of the message I would say there is that we all have to embrace this from an approach of that we're in this together, right? It's not just the private or the public. Everybody's got to work together to actually achieve the goal that we all can agree on from the very outset. And I think the private sector is obviously more nimble and able to deliver products in a changing environment much faster than the public sector, but inevitably the decision-making authority on mega projects comes from the public sector, and it's something that everybody has to embrace and find a way to make work.
No, I agree, and I have an example also of a bubble deck. If anybody's ever heard of bubble deck, they do it in Germany all the time. It's a deck where basically they found out that all the concrete between the rebar in the middle of the deck is basically doing nothing. So why do we need concrete there? Let's use bubbles to put them in there. And it worked great in Stuttgart, worked great somewhere in the Alps, but the problem was they came here and they had to build a plant and a facility here in the United States to do that, in New York to do that. And then they realized the politics of building a concrete plant and telling concrete plants we don't need your concrete. So it became much more of a political issue. I think value around this comes from the new paradigm that's happening, I think, driven from actually the federal government, is the concept of whole life cycle asset management for cost, right? This is really a key concept. You know, John and I teach a class together, John Parkinson and I teach a class together at Columbia, and we're always saying, like, you have to think about the whole life cycle cost of an asset. What does it cost to build a building? And the whole life cycle cost, it may only be between 10, 12, or 15% of the total cost of the whole life cycle of that asset. So in the context of, the previous panel, I think it was Rafi was talking about, what's the difference if you just pay $10,000 for a piece of the technology? The real cost is in the asset of this asset is in the maintenance and the whole life cycle cost. So if you think about it, by driving best practices early on in the process of building the building, investing in the building, new processes, things like green globes, and passive house, putting them into buildings, if the client and owner understand the value of that in the whole life cycle cost, they might say, my gosh, this is something we can do. And because they're now mandating that public agencies have to have asset management plans, now they can start taking a look at the whole life cycle cost. And I think, in particular, Alan, this is where really the QS industry can really be impactful in helping drive that efficiency and value into that process. I see it every day working at Turner & Townsend, and I really think this is a great opportunity for value capture.
Okay, just dwelling on that point a minute then, and perhaps Tim can come in here, because certainly the way PPP PFI was done in Europe, it hit a bit of a snag in terms of data for whole life performance and collecting data in a standardized way. I mean, do people spend a lot of time collecting life cycle cost data in the US? Is there a way to do it? Can it be improved? Just a general point, Tim, about data informing, if you like, designing with the end in mind, and data informing decision making at the front end of projects, particularly life cycle data.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very good point. Just to put it in perspective, when you talk about public-private partnerships in the U.S., less than 1% of our infrastructure is delivered with private money. In Europe, in Canada, and Australia, it's closer to 10%. So we're missing a big option there. The ones that do look at that, the concessions that are in play, get it, and they look at those types of analytics and the data management of how can I drive value, just like Jim was saying. If design is equal to 1, construction is equal to 10, operations and maintenance for 30 years is equal to 100, how can I drive that value? And they get it, and they see that very much. We're seeing, we talk about new technologies, but we're also seeing, when I was at McKinsey, we see a new creation coming about in terms of positions and jobs. One of the fastest growing in our industry is data analytics. And we're seeing students coming out of data analytics programs being gobbled up by the Bechtels, by the Skanskas of the world, by the concessions who are putting these P3s together, because they're mining that data in a very serious way because they know it needs money.
Alan, just one point I'll add to that. I think one of the reasons why alternative financing, as Tim is alluding to, is missing. I hate to say it. I think it's a cultural shift at the end user and at the owner level, right? What are the margins for the consultants? 6%, 8%, 10%, maybe. Contractors are making what, 4%, 6%? Right? So what's the return on investment? I mean, where's KP? He said something about 30%, and I want to be invited to that party because he was complaining about somebody else's party. I would love to be at the 30% party, right? Because if we look at the tech sector, we'd be like, wow, this is amazing. So I think one of the issues, and again, I think there's guaranteed rates of return in some of these other markets, and the benefit that they're getting upfront is actually infusion and injection of capital. I think part of the issue is that needs change is how we actually account for capital versus operational expenses at the agency levels, right? Capital is separated out. Lifecycle costs are usually put on the O&M side of the equation, so nobody pays attention to it. Most of the money goes into capital of building the asset, but not actually enough to actually maintain the asset for the term of its probable useful life. So I think all of that is change that's needed, and I sort of put it under the reform or the innovative end of it. But I think all of that somehow can also help provide capital funding within the capital program for technological innovation and change in partnership with the private sector. So I sort of see that as more likely than traditional P3 investment, just because I think the U.S. market is culturally not geared up for it at the moment. But I think the ability to bring in tech companies and sort of embed them with public sector partners is maybe space that's going to be much more interesting in the next couple of years.
Okay.
And
Go ahead, Jim.
And I think in the interest of this panel discussion topic for mega projects, and I want to bring back to what I'd said earlier, I think Debra and the technology that Debra and the previous panel had brought forward are going to be critical. If we think of it in the context of cohorts of mega projects working together to create that depth of data, right? Through machine learning, through AI, pushing and pumping data analytics, we can really extract a lot of value. And this is where having that person, we can't be afraid to have that person who is that technology person sitting at the seat with the construction team as part of a valued member on that construction war team.
Okay, Debra, I do want to come back to you, but before I do, just after Debra's answered this question, because I'm going to ask a slightly different question, perhaps you can think about a question to ask, because we'll open it up to the floor for questions in a minute. So, Debra, I just wanted to ask, in relation to that comment about data analytics, particularly in life cycle costing, one of the things that's not been discussed too much today is how we integrate costs more into design-centric BIM models and operational information as well, 5D and 6D if you like. We've talked about 4D a bit, but I know that Autodesk are working on this. What's your view on where this is going in terms of full interaction between cost and operational data and design data in a BIM model?
Okay, so we have multiple technologies to handle 4D, 5D, 6D between Revit, Navisworks, BIM 360, and now we have BIM 360 cost management. Mm-hmm. And you're able to extract that information automatically. And now that we've acquired multiple companies, now we have a lot of more technology that will help do these quantity takeoffs. So you're going to have all that information at your fingertips. And like I said, I think more around understanding the project with Project IQ and understanding more in-depth data, and you can customize these dashboards such that you can have better insights into your projects. And so you'll have this predictive insights into all of your data. So I think that the information, but I also want to go back to, and I keep on telling people, you know, I'm global. I look at the UK BIM mandates, and you talk about cohorts and things like that. Collaboration is the #1 thing. The BIM mandates mandate the level 2 that you all collaborate in the same way with standards, information, and like someone else was saying, there's so much talk. It's really talking about different tools and making sure that your collaboration is happening at the very beginning of the project. You know, when I joined, we talked about IPD, Integrated Project Delivery. I have not heard that once yet today. That was huge before. That's having everybody at the forefront deciding on a project and what the value you're going to bring to that customer, and you digitally agree upon it, and you have these discussions up front, and everybody is on the same page, understanding the value of the digital design data and how you get that, and agreeing upon schedules and having that information at your fingertips. But going back, it just is really enlightening that we have so many issues here in New York where we can't do these types of things.
Very interesting. Yeah. So questions, please. Who's first? Yes, sir.
Hopefully you can all hear me. So in the United Kingdom, off the back of Crossrail, despite the diabolical mess of the £5 billion overspend, a great thing that came out of that was a database, not of all the data, but actually of the technology companies that they'd brought to the party and the lessons around this little startup who can do something cool. And so I haven't seen that outside really of the UK or the EU. But I guess the question to those of you who are in the private sector, I guess there would also be the opportunity for you internally or with other commercial partners to almost build a commercial version of that as part of a value add to your clients. So I wonder if either of you have actually thought of doing that. Sure. I mean, I think what you have is, again, the idea around cohorts and leveraging these mega projects that we have coming out. So the problem you might have is projects don't want to share information with other projects, right? They want to keep that to proprietary information, right? So how do we sort of break those chains and break those bounds? What we can do is through major cohorts and bringing large projects and programs together, leveraging technology across multiple projects, platforms, and agencies, we can start to develop those databases where we have those lessons learned, right? Where you have so much data coming into a platform, so much data coming into a mega program, $50 billion, $100 billion, and then being able to take that information and create lessons learned and push it forward. We're not going to leave it on the stage, right? I think that's the absolute worst thing we can do is leave it on the stage. We need to actually take that information and then make it as a force multiplier to push it into future projects and grow on that information.
I'm glad you brought up Crossrail. I think Crossrail, for all of the cost overrun and delay issues, is one of the greatest examples of innovation in the industry, isn't it? As far as the innovation factory that they created, the TUCA, the Tunneling and Underground Construction Academy, where they created underground and TBM jobs in the UK, a skill set that did not exist before. But they did that in conjunction with that vision. So I think that's a great example. I think T5 in the UK is another great example of innovation and strategy. And I think there are nuggets like that out there, but not very many, are there?
Okay, thank you. Who was next for a question? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Hi. Hi, Rafi Holzer. This is probably mostly for Ali, but I'll let the whole panel address it as you see fit. I'm a bit of a mass transit nerd, and it's been much talked about that building a mile of rail in New York City costs at least 5 times as much as the next most costly city. I've read a number of analyses about why that is, the most compelling of which has explained it based on the fact that we have this very fragmented, federated system in the United States, and particularly in New York, where you have multiple agencies sitting on top of one another or needing to interact with one another to get things done. I'm wondering, is that an accurate diagnosis for why the costs are as high as they are, or is there something else that's going on?
Pass.
I've gotten that answer before as well.
I'm listening.
Not an expert on the subject by any means. I think there's far smarter people looking at it. The two pieces of information I'll throw out there. I know the article that supposedly deduced this. I think it's a little unfair. I think one of the reasons why it's a little unfair is dollar for dollar. And I think they looked at Second Avenue Subway Phase 1 as the example. If you actually get into the details of the project, there's much more in the project than actually Second Avenue Subway. It's just how the bureaucracy of capital planning works at an agency like the MTA. Because capital planning occurs on a 5-year cycle. You front load it with money that's actually available or revenues that are available. They usually never fund the whole 5 years for various reasons. It comes at the tail end. So what happens with mega projects, especially in that space, is you find your needs where you've had those needs for capital planning that were unfunded, and you lump them in together when something becomes available that is politically attractive. Everybody lines up behind a project, and then you try to put as much as you can under that umbrella because your needs are still not met, so you need to meet those needs somehow, right? Because you've got the largest public transportation system on the planet that moves 6.4 million people every day, 24/7 a day. Find me another system on the planet that does that, right? So people at the MTA do the best that they can under the circumstances and conditions they have to deal with. A lot of it is sometimes political. And I think so if you look at the actual capital planning for a project like that, it's much more. So for example, utility relocation alone. No other jurisdiction in this country exists where the public sector pays for the utility relocation costs. It's only in New York City because it's something that goes back maybe 70, 80 years when the utilities were public. And then they were offloaded and obviously sold off as private, but the laws never changed, so the public sector still pays for the cost for mega companies that otherwise are the monopolies in the city. Try changing that law, and they've tried it twice. So I think a lot of that is unfair, in my opinion, to what happens on mega capital project planning. But you really sort of have to get into details of what was actually parked under the umbrella of, for example, Second Avenue Subway, because it actually extended out into Phase 2 that obviously hasn't started yet. But a lot of that work for Phase 2 was done under Phase 1. So mile for mile, the benefit was much more further than just Phase 1. So again, that's probably a much bigger conversation and goes without saying, but I'll say it, I think labor costs add up as well in a place like New York City.
Insurance.
Right-of-way acquisitions, right? Property acquisitions are probably pretty expensive here as compared to other jurisdictions. So those costs do add up. I will say this, though, that's not a criticism, obviously, the system that we've all subscribed to. I truly also believe, I go back to the same sort of mantra, that we're all in this together. We choose to run a 24/7 system. We choose a system that makes it awfully challenging to do any construction or any staging or any upgrades, because why? You're still running trains on those tracks 24/7. No other system on the planet can afford to do it and still maintain it in a state of good repair. So we choose as residents, as consumers of the system, those decisions. We support them, but they come at a cost too, and I think part of that is a cost.
I was just going to add, I think many studies have also shown that optimism bias in public sector projects is a major problem, and I'm sure that's the case, actually. Yeah. Okay, sorry, yes, sir.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up question to my last question, but do you see the values in other sectors, specifically maybe healthcare or in other sectors, that we can apply into our sector? I know it's two different things, but are there any special ideas that, especially with the bureaucracy part in the public, the governments, because honestly, this is just my opinion, you shouldn't have to be worried about being killed by a bridge that's collapsed versus a bypass, So it's funny, you can have a bypass today and you're out tomorrow, but yet, you can still die from a bridge that fails because we just don't have the proper, technology to get it repaired or fixed efficiently.
I'll take a crack.
Thanks,
at
Tim.
that. If you look at a couple of great examples, look at the life sciences industry. They complete $500 to $1 billion projects in about half the time it does in the public sector. Why is that? Because they have 7 years to maintain that patent once the drugs are being produced. So they're driven with a business case. If you look at public sector projects, they don't always have a strong business case that supports that. The other aspect, the other thing I would comment on, when you look at other sectors, and Debra, you mentioned this before, IPD, you referenced, look at what was done in Australia with alliance contracting. Anyone who's studied alliance contracting for decades has seen such a tremendous success ratio, schedule-wise and budget-wise, in a solution like that. But here in the United States, we can't do a simple IPD project because everyone is so stuck in their ways.
We're doing one now. I'm just going to throw it out there.
Okay, any more questions? Yes, this lady here.
So this is in reference to the previous conversation where somebody asked a question about pilots and especially, doing a pilot with the government agency. And I guess subsequent answer was not to even approach it. I'm wondering if you guys have any different opinion about it, or like what is the best way or approach to go about, implementing technology in a government agency?
Well, I think there are certain agencies in other states that they actually have offices for innovation, right? So the offices of innovation that actually they invite you to come and give them their ideas around options for infrastructure and for projects that will better the community and also better that agency's effort. So there's also things that they do like smart cities, smart city initiatives, right? So you can do smart city initiatives, but this takes, again, a group of very talented, it's a very expensive undertaking for you to do a smart cities initiative for the city of New York, which companies have done. So in the case of Los Angeles, they actually, again, they have an innovation office. I believe, if I'm not correct, isn't MTA creating an office of innovation?
They are, and they also have that tech lab, right? The Transit Tech Lab with Rachel Holt's group
That's right.
and Kathy
That's
Waller.
right. AXM.
So I'll speak to it, but go ahead.
And they're starting it here in New York, and that of course will flow. I think it'll flow out to other agencies. So I think that's where we can get innovation into the public sector from the private sector to do that.
I'll throw a couple of thoughts out there. So one, I don't think it's obviously impossible. I think it happens actually every day in the city. It just takes a different route. In my own experience has been usually the tech sector comes into New York, which by the way is booming, right? So let's just accept the fact that everybody wants to leave California, come to New York, which is a good thing. So the tech sector is doing pretty well in New York. It's obviously booming. Google's here. Everybody else is expanding. People are getting hired. There's more jobs here in the tech sector than we've ever had before. So there's obviously a good reason for it because they're obviously much smarter than I'll ever be, so they're making good decisions. So I think what's happening more than anything else is that the startups are coming here because a lot of VC funding is really originating out of New York. It used to go somewhere else and all over the world. Now it's finding a home base here. But they're finding applications for the technology in the private space, really sort of proving the worth of the product and getting a certain share in the market, and then getting the attention from the public sector that says, wait a second, what is this? And how can I use it? I'll give you two examples. Again, just sort of a transportation guy, so that's where I end up. For example, Accessoride, an MTA system, been around forever for paratransit and disabled riders. Been around for a long time, nobody likes it, least of all the end user. It's a little obsolete. It's unfortunate. It doesn't get the same level of investment it's had before. And Pat, for running the MT now, is very passionate about reforming it and changing it, which is a breath of fresh air. But I'll give you an example. For folks that don't know how the system works, you have to call in a hotline. You got to reserve for like a clinic appointment to go to your doctor's at least 48 hours in advance. It can get canceled because it gets outsourced to a third party based on supply and demand. They can only pick up a certain number of people. So it all works out that unfortunately, if you were a wheelchair-bound end user that needs to go to your doctor's appointment and you made the appointment, you did everything right, it could still get canceled on the day off or it could be delayed. And it just doesn't bode well for us as a society if that's how we treat people, right? It's the most vulnerable that need to be treated and need to be prioritized with a certain amount of dignity. So enter Uber and Lyft and ride-sharing companies, and then guess what happens? Finally, MTA does one pilot for a year that says, you know what, we're going to put this on an Uber app. And you can access, there's still a hotline number you can call, but by the way, you can use an app. And by the way, you don't have to wait outside. You can be in the comfort and the convenience and the dignity of your home. Somebody can show up and pick you up. They'll bring a wheelchair accessible car. If Uber doesn't have one, they can actually pay a yellow cab to show up and do it for you, and they'll work that deal out. So we did it for a year, skyrocketed, was successful, and the end user was much happier. But now, was there 3 years of resistance to it before the pilot actually took off the ground? Of course. because the system that works the way it exists doesn't want to change. It's disruption, right? And that happens maybe in every industry where there's disruption. But technology existed that was already doing well, and I think that's what I see. I see that with Nexar now, if anybody knows Nexar, and it's a phone-based camera device, really for insurance purposes, right? There's about 55,000 users of Nexar on New York City streets any single minute, because basically ride-sharing cars. But guess what? I've seen it. Agencies are looking at the fact that they can piggyback off it to see traffic flow in real time, as to where the largest amount of congestion is in the city and how to manage traffic better than we've ever done before. We're doing that with drones now, for example, with traffic management. So I think those existed, and then they were somehow incorporated into the public sector scheme. But the public sector tends to be very shy at embracing something that it hasn't seen sort of the worth of before. So there's a way to do it. You sort of have to partner with somebody to get the product out there and pick up some share, and then the public sector is much more receptive to it.
Okay, have we got time for one final question, perhaps? One final question, yes. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Lewis Rantown, Townsend. So picking up on what Jim was saying, and Crossrail's been mentioned. So Crossrail's done something called the Crossrail Learning Legacy, where they're sharing all their data. They've got Crossrail International, which is sort of a consultancy arm, going around the world sharing practices and lessons learned. You said about setting up mega projects and programs to share data. How realistic do we think that is in the New York market, and what are some of the challenges we have to overcome to achieve that?
Sure. I think the New York market is primed for innovation. It's primed for collaboration between multiple organizations to come in with really that benchmark database, right, of information around how projects have performed around the world. We could take Crossrail as an example, T5 as an example. Look at the innovation that we had there and see how that's going to play out in major mega projects that are planned for the city and state of New York. And again, this goes back to the cohort theory. If we can look at this and take those lessons learned and push them into multiple projects that serve both the private sector and the public sector, we can then grab value from that data information. But the key to that is also going to be, let's grab that information and then build on that information. Again, don't leave it on the deck. Let's pick it up. Let's make it a force multiplier and push it deeper and deeper into our agencies. And the agencies are seeing change in the city of New York. I mean, just alone, you have the MTAs moving to 100% design build, right, which will lead to IPD, right? You have the New York City Housing Authority. They have been given design build authority. I mean, these are like paradigm shifts like you can't believe in this industry. So they're going to need to leverage this good, smart information from lessons learned so that we can build better assets. And we also, again, need to link that back to the whole life cycle asset, cost and management. And this is where we'll extract value. Thank you.
I'll add one piece to it. I think the one piece we haven't talked about is this disaster recovery. Unfortunately, obviously, it's not a good thing. But we see more inclement weather, natural disaster conditions every year. And I think in jurisdictions like New York, which are prone to flooding and particularly harsh storms, at least at the AECOM level, we're seeing a lot of utilization and application of deployable technology in a very short period of time. So if you've got a product and you're working on some solution that can actually help communities bounce back, put the infrastructure back into place, bring the grid back online. It's something that I think is a key market going into the future to be able to do, because again, it sort of hits all those notes. It's public purpose, it's helping communities at the end of the day. It's something that's needed that you can't shy from. There's no choice, you have to do it, and we're using a lot of our available technologies and our personnel around the world really to maximize use of technology and providing that sort of benefit. I think disaster recovery is something that, especially in the world of cloud computing, for example, in some instances, we worked on the Virgin Islands, bounced back, doing some work in Puerto Rico and some other places as well. I mean, we literally had design work done in 24 hours at what we at AECOM call Global Design Service Centers. We've got about 6 of them now around the planet, and we can literally turn out designs in 24 hours in disaster hit areas and then have personnel on the ground implementing work. Because unfortunately, that's just becoming more and more of a necessity, and I think we have to be prepared for it.
Yeah, and also following up on lessons learned. So very interesting about what happened in Katrina as opposed to what happened in Hurricane Sandy. So in Katrina, we learned a very valuable lesson. So when Katrina hit New Orleans, they moved everybody out. They went to Houston, they went to Baton Rouge, they went to Dallas. And the problem was they went to go back in, do their assessments, and nobody came back. So the Ninth Ward right now in New Orleans is still ostensibly just sort of abandoned. So what they learned after Hurricane Sandy hit, Superstorm Sandy, they instantly created an office called Build It Back in Place, where the governor and the city and the state worked to keep people in their homes. Even though their homes were partially destroyed, they got them back electrical power and they got them back heat. So they kept people in their houses and didn't allow them, didn't give them an option to stay in their homes. This was a huge benefit and a lesson learned in that process, and really helped to keep and helped New York to rebound much, much quicker.
I think we've more or less come to a close there, but thank you very much for your questions, and thank you very much. My personal thanks to the panel, and perhaps we can all show them our appreciation in the usual manner. Thank you.